Before a hall glittering with silks and jewels, the future of a kingdom hung on one decision. Tradition demanded he choose a bride from the most powerful noble families, yet his gaze sought the quiet figure standing among the servants. In a single step, he shattered centuries of protocol, placing his fate, the crown's honor, and her life in the balance. All because his heart refused to obey the throne. The crystal chandeliers trembled faintly with the weight of their own grandeur, scattering a golden light that clung to every polished surface of the Palacio Real's great hall. Beneath them, the assembly of Spain's nobility shimmered as if they too had been arranged for display. Ladies draped in the richest brocades, their hair sculpted into elaborate coils, jeweled combs catching and holding the light. Gentlemen in embroidered coats and pressed uniforms, their posture the product of generations bred to rule. The scent of orange blossom water drifted over the air, mingling with the deeper sweetness of beeswax from the freshly polished floors. The distant sound of a string quartet came from the gallery above, each note falling delicately, as though careful not to disturb the solemnity of the occasion. Every gesture in the room seemed rehearsed. The way a noblewoman tilted her head as she spoke in low tones, the way a gentleman's gloved hand rested lightly on his sword hilt, a casual reminder of authority. Even the servants moved like shadows along the edges, their steps soft, their hands quick. At the far end of the hall, beneath the high arch of the doors, the master of ceremonies stood motionless, his staff of office held upright. His eyes scanned the crowd, and the crowd in turn watched him with growing anticipation. Tonight would bring the announcement of Prince Fernando's future bride, a choice meant to secure alliances, preserve the monarchy's dignity, and satisfy the eyes and ears of Europe. Murmured speculation rippled through the hall like an undercurrent, each noble tongue shaping the name of a favored candidate, each whisper carrying a hint of ambition. Along the right wall, near a long table gleaming with silver and crystal, Inez moved in silence. She carried a silver tray with the careful balance born of years of service, her eyes lowered so as not to meet those of the guests. Her dress, plain and well kept, brushed lightly against her ankles, the muted gray of it allowing her to fade into the periphery. She knew every contour of this room, every gleam of the marble floor, every subtle dip in the heavy carpet beneath the noble's feet. And yet she felt the weight of the evening more acutely than ever before. She had no business listening, but in a hall where whispers and glances could decide a person's fate, it was impossible not to absorb the atmosphere. Snatches of conversation drifted to her. Mention of the House of Guzman, the wealth of the Montijos, the influence of the Velascos. The names belonged to women she had glimpsed at a distance, glittering and confident, each moving with the certainty that she might become the next princess. The idea of the prince ever noticing her, a maid whose hand smelled faintly of lemon from polishing the silver, was as absurd as imagining the sun stooping to speak to a candle flame. A subtle shift in the music drew every head toward the great doors. The master of ceremonies raised his staff, and a hush fell over the crowd, so sudden and complete that even the faint rustle of silk became audible. Inez paused in her work, her tray poised in midair, caught in the stillness that gripped the room. She could feel the tension gathering in the space, the collective breath being held for a single moment. The doors began to open. From her position near the table, Inez saw the first glimmer of uniform, dark fabric, gold embroidery, polished boots. The prince's arrival was not simply an entrance. It was a shift in the very air, the slow turning of every gaze toward the man whose choice would ripple through generations. The candlelight seemed to burn brighter, as though drawn to him. Inez reminded herself to lower her head, to disappear behind the lowered arc of her lashes. Yet she felt an unsteady pull to look up, to see what all others beheld. She caught the barest glimpse of his profile as he crossed the threshold, the strong line of his jaw, the high collar of his uniform framing his face, before forcing her eyes back to the crystal goblets she was arranging. Around her, the murmur resumed in quieter tones, the restrained excitement of those who believed themselves favored. The air was warmer now, or perhaps it was the nearness of so many bodies, the faint heat from the chandeliers above pressing downward. She set a crystal glass in its place and reached for another, her fingers brushing the cool rim as the faint rhythm of boots approached across the marble floor. She did not look up, though her awareness sharpened. The steps slowed, halting somewhere near her table. A brief silence opened in the surrounding noise, as though a ripple in the current had stilled the waters for an instant. Her hands continued their work with mechanical precision, but her breath had grown unsteady, shallow in her chest. A deep, steady inhale came from just beyond her field of vision, and the air shifted faintly, the way it does when someone of presence and rank has chosen a place to stand. She could feel it without needing to see. The polished scent of wool and leather mixed with something sharper, a cologne touched with citrus, unfamiliar, yet not unpleasant. Somewhere across the hall, a lady laughed lightly, too quickly, as though to draw attention back to herself. But the silence close to Inez's side lingered, taut and deliberate. She placed the final goblet on the tray and straightened just enough to turn toward the pitcher, her fingers brushing its cool silver surface. The staff of the master of ceremonies struck the floor once, the sharp sound echoing across the marble, and in the charged stillness that followed, the herald's voice rang out, announcing the prince's presence. Yet the prince was not looking at the crowd. His gaze, steady and unwavering, was fixed on her. The room seemed to draw inward on itself, as if the walls had leaned closer, the air thickened, and the music retreated into a muted haze. For a moment, Inez could not tell whether anyone else noticed that the prince's attention had broken from its ceremonial path. He was meant to stand before the line of nobility, to greet each dignitary in turn. But instead his gaze lingered on her with a quiet, searching intensity. Prince Fernando moved forward at a measured pace, the soft gleam of his boots catching the light as if the marble floor had been polished for him alone. His uniform was immaculate. The deep navy of the royal cavalry coat contrasted with gold braid that ran along the edges, medals glinting at his chest. The faint sway of his sword at his hip gave him a presence both martial and sovereign. And yet, for all the precision of his attire, his attention held an ungoverned quality, something unbound by the strict order of the evening. The nobility adjusted their stances as he passed, women subtly angling their shoulders to present a better view of jeweled necklaces, men bowing just low enough to be dignified without seeming servile. Murmured greetings floated toward him, each voice carefully modulated. He returned them with a nod or a brief word, but without the warmth that would have satisfied the hopes of those seeking his favor. His eyes kept drifting past the curve of the crowd toward the servants' line where Inez stood. Her fingers trembled faintly against the handle of the silver pitcher she held. She told herself she was imagining it, that surely he was looking beyond her to someone else, but every time she risked a glance upward, she found his gaze waiting for hers. The knowledge unsettled her as much as it quickened her pulse. Near the dais, the Queen Mother sat tall in a carved chair upholstered in crimson velvet, the heavy folds of her gown cascading to the floor. Her fan lay closed in her lap, one gloved hand resting lightly atop it. Her face betrayed nothing, but Inez could sense the watchfulness in that stillness. Every movement in the hall was known to her, every deviation from protocol measured against the expectations of the crown. Fernando slowed as he approached the long refreshment table, his eyes never breaking from their invisible tether to Inez's face. The surrounding nobles, puzzled by his uncustomary direction, parted slightly to make way for him. The air between them thinned until Inez could hear the faint brush of fabric as he drew near, the scent of his cologne more distinct. Bright citrus layered over darker notes of cedar. She lowered her head, her lashes casting shadows over her cheeks. Her voice, if she tried to use it, would betray her. Still, she sensed the shift of his weight as he reached for something on the table. A crystal goblet left the tray beneath her hand, his fingers brushing close enough that the barest tremor ran along her skin. He did not look at the drink he had taken. His attention was wholly, deliberately fixed on her. "You serve with great care," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. The sound of it was rich, with the restrained power of someone accustomed to command, and yet there was something unexpected in its tone. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest edge of defiance. She dared only the smallest reply. "It is my duty, Your Highness." His lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "And does duty leave you any thought for yourself?" The question unsettled her. Servants did not speak of themselves to their betters, and certainly not to a prince. She gripped the handle of the pitcher tighter, as though the silver might anchor her. "I have all I require," she murmured. His gaze deepened, studying her with the same deliberation he might give to a map of contested territory. "I wonder," he said softly, "if you believe that." A ripple of voices rose and fell behind him as a nobleman approached to make his bow. Fernando turned briefly to acknowledge the man's greeting, then shifted his attention back to her as if the interruption were inconsequential. Her heart was beating too fast. The warmth in her chest felt dangerously like hope, though she knew better. A prince's gaze could never rest long on a maid without consequence. For her, most of all. She willed herself to focus on the task before her, to retreat into the safety of invisibility. But he lingered, his thumb tracing absently along the rim of the goblet he held. "Tell me your name," he said. The sound of her own voice felt strange in her throat. "Ines, Your Highness." "Ines," he repeated, as though committing it to memory. The string quartet shifted to a slower waltz, the melody curling through the air like smoke. Somewhere across the room, a noblewoman laughed with delicate precision, her tone rising just enough to be overheard. Yet the prince did not glance away. She wanted to step back, to put distance between them, but the edge of the table pressed against her hip, and his nearness held her still. The space around them seemed to pulse, filled with something she could not name but felt in every breath. From the dais, the Queen Mother's gaze swept toward them. The change was subtle, but Inez felt it, a tightening of the atmosphere, a note of disapproval carried without a single spoken word. She kept her head bowed, hoping the gesture might deflect whatever scrutiny she had drawn. Fernando took a slow sip from the goblet, his eyes never leaving hers, and then set it back onto the table. "I shall remember you," he said quietly. Her pulse stuttered. "There is no need." "There is," he interrupted, his tone quiet but absolute. The murmurs in the hall seemed sharper now, the curious glances more frequent. The nobleman who had approached earlier remained nearby, watching them with open interest. Somewhere, the master of ceremonies shifted his weight, his gaze flicking toward the Queen Mother as though awaiting some silent signal. Fernando stepped back just enough to give the impression of resuming his proper course. Yet his eyes lingered on her one last time before he turned toward the waiting nobility. The moment should have ended there, folded neatly into the long history of royal indifference toward servants. But Inez knew, with a certainty that unsettled her more than she could admit, that it had not ended at all. Across the hall, the herald's voice called for the assembly to prepare for the presentation of the eligible noblewomen, but the prince was no longer looking at them. The music shifted, swelling with an ornate flourish as the herald called the first name. All eyes turned toward the archway where the line of young noblewomen waited to be presented. Their gowns shimmered like a moving jewel box, silks and satins catching the candlelight with each careful step. The rustle of fabric, the faint perfume of roses and violet water, the practiced curves of their smiles. Everything was calculated to draw a prince's eye and secure his favor. Inez kept her gaze on her work, though the parade unfolded in her peripheral vision. Each introduction was a moment of measured pride, a father's formal bow, a mother's approving nod, the young lady's graceful curtsy. It was a ritual older than memory, repeated in every royal court across the continent. The prince acknowledged each woman with the same precise bow, his voice polite, his expression steady. But she noticed it. The absence of heat in his manner, the way his eyes never lingered on the faces presented to him. He was courteous, yes, but not captivated. Between each greeting, his gaze strayed to the edges of the hall, as if the true object of his attention were not among the glittering ranks before him. The Queen Mother's composure was flawless, though Inez could sense the steel beneath it. From her seat on the dais, she watched the ceremony like a hawk guarding the borders of her domain. Her gloved fingers rested on her closed fan, unmoving, yet Inez could feel the weight of her vigilance reaching into every corner of the room. Inez shifted slightly, adjusting the angle of the silver pitcher in her hand. She reminded herself to breathe evenly, to remain invisible as the maids beside her did, but her skin tingled with the awareness that she had already been seen in a way she had never intended. One by one, the noble women crossed the marble to stand before the prince. He spoke to them briefly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the nearest courtiers. And still, in those moments when the introductions faltered, a step taken too slowly, a name repeated, she would feel his gaze reach for her again. Her pulse beat faster each time. It was dangerous, this silent exchange, for the court was trained to notice even the subtlest currents beneath the surface. She could already sense curiosity sparking in the whispers that darted between the nobles. At last, the herald's voice rose above the murmurs. "Your Highness, the court awaits your decision." The hush that followed was deep enough that the faint creak of a floorboard seemed to echo across the marble expanse. Inez's breath caught. This was the moment, the choosing that would seal the alliances so carefully arranged by the crown. The prince turned, as tradition demanded, to face the Queen Mother. She inclined her head once, granting him the silent authority to speak. All around him, expectant faces tilted upward. Some eyes shone with hope, others with calculation. Inez lowered her gaze to the table before her. She told herself she should not watch, that the choosing was for the nobility alone, but the silence pressed against her, demanding to be witnessed. She glanced up and found him already looking at her. It was not the fleeting glance of courtesy he had given the noblewomen. It was direct, unbroken, a quiet declaration in itself. Her chest tightened. The weight of his attention in that moment felt like a touch, unseen but unmistakable. A faint murmur began to ripple through the crowd, growing louder as he stepped forward. His direction was unmistakable. He was not turning toward the gathered daughters of Spain's greatest houses. He was moving toward the long table at the edge of the hall. Inez felt rooted to the spot, as though the very marble beneath her feet had turned to ice. Her fingers clenched the handle of the pitcher, the polished metal cool against her palm. The nobles nearest to him shifted aside, confusion flickering across their faces. The Queen Mother's stillness became something sharper. A pause before steel is drawn. Fernando crossed the final distance between them, his shadow falling across the linen and crystal. The faint sound of his boots was the only movement in a hall that seemed to have forgotten to breathe. Inez could not look away, though every instinct urged her to retreat. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine stitching along the collar of his coat, the pale gleam of the metal at his chest. He did not speak. He did not need to. Every gaze in the hall followed the silent line between them, and the murmurs thickened into a tide of disbelief. Somewhere behind the press of nobles, someone let out a sharp breath, and a glass clinked against a silver tray. And then the prince took another step forward. Gasps broke like sudden wind across the hall. The shift was almost physical, a swell of bodies drawing back, the delicate rustle of skirts, and the abrupt stillness of 100 watching eyes. The prince stood before Inez, his nearness an unspoken claim. His shadow spilled over the linen-covered table, across the silver trays and crystal goblets, until it touched the hem of her plain gown. Her fingers tightened on the pitcher's handle. She could feel the tremor in her wrist, the heat rising in her throat. There was no hiding now. She had been pulled into the center of a storm without taking a single step. Murmurs rippled outward, gathering force. Faces once composed now bore sharp edges of shock or thinly veiled disdain. A few of the younger ladies exchanged wide-eyed glances, as if unsure whether this was a breach of etiquette or an unprecedented scandal in the making. From the dais, the Queen Mother rose. The movement was slow but inexorable, as if the very air bent to accommodate her authority. Her gown of silver-gray silk caught the light, and the metallic threads in the embroidery shimmered like frost. The soft click of her heels against the marble echoed faintly as she descended the steps, every measured pace drawing the attention of the whole tighter. Inez stood frozen, the pounding of her pulse drowning the distant strains of the quartet. She could feel the weight of the Queen Mother's approach before she saw it, the invisible pressure of a gaze that measured and judged without mercy. Fernando did not step aside. His presence seemed to expand in quiet defiance, as though he were a wall between Inez and the tide of expectation pressing in from all sides. The closeness of him was overwhelming, the faint citrus of his cologne, the dark gleam of his hair beneath the candlelight, the heat radiating through the air between them. No words had yet been spoken, but the choice was there, laid bare in the open. A prince's attention fixed on a maid, in a hall meant to unite the highest houses of Spain. The Queen Mother reached the floor, her figure cutting through the ring of onlookers that had formed. She stopped just beyond arm's length, her posture a lesson in regal command. The closed fan in her hand was as rigid as a blade. The tension between them, mother and son, was palpable. The silence they held seemed more dangerous than any public reprimand. Her gaze moved briefly over Inez, a glance that weighed and dismissed in the same instant, before returning to Fernando. Still, he did not move. Somewhere in the crowd, a goblet was set down too hard, the crystal ringing sharply. No one spoke. The air itself seemed suspended, caught between the inevitability of tradition and the unpredictable will of the heir to the throne. Inez's breath came shallowly, her ribs aching with the effort to contain it. She wanted to shrink into the marble, to vanish into the walls, but she stood as still as the silver on the table, caught in the current of forces far larger than herself. Fernando extended his hand toward her. The gesture was steady, deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Her eyes flickered to it, then to his face. She saw the quiet determination there, the same expression he had worn when he'd first looked at her across the hall, but now weighted with resolve. Around them, the murmurs swelled into something harsher. The court had begun to understand what they were witnessing, and the knowledge rippled through them like the quick spread of fire. The herald, who had been standing frozen near the entrance, cast a desperate glance toward the Queen Mother. He did not speak. It was not his place. But the unspoken plea was clear. Give the word, and the breach will be closed. The Queen Mother's voice did not come. Instead, the space between them contracted to a single breathless instant. A prince with his hand extended, a maid staring at the impossible, and a hall full of witnesses waiting for a command that might never arrive. The Queen Mother took a single step forward. The Queen Mother's step was soundless on the marble, yet it carried the force of an entire court closing in. She halted before them, her height magnified by the poise of her spine and the sweep of her gown. The light from the chandeliers caught the silver embroidery at her sleeves, casting cold glints along the intricate pattern, beauty sharpened into authority. She did not glance at the murmuring crowd. She did not need to. The weight of her presence alone subdued the room to a hush so taut that Inez felt as though a single breath could snap it. In this hall, the Queen Mother said, her voice low but carrying to every corner, the choice is made serve the crown before they serve the heart. Her words were not directed to anyone in particular, but their meaning struck like a measured blow. Several noblemen shifted in place, some straightening as if to distance themselves from the brewing impropriety. A ripple of unease passed through the noblewomen. One adjusted the set of her shoulders, another smoothed the fabric of her gown with restless fingers. Fernando's jaw tightened, though his expression remained composed. And yet, he replied evenly, the crown is nothing without the will to honor what is true. The faint lift of her brow was the only sign of reaction. Truth, she said, does not always serve the realm. Inez kept her gaze fixed on the silver pitcher before her, but the words seemed to pull her into the very center of their unspoken contest. She felt exposed, like a thread pulled loose in the fabric of the court's careful design. The heat of the prince's nearness was both a shield and a brand, protecting her from the immediate grasp of authority, yet marking her in the eyes of everyone who watched. The Queen Mother's attention shifted to her, a glance that measured everything and granted nothing. "Step aside, child," she said quietly, the tone one might use with someone not expected to refuse. Inez's fingers curled tighter around the pitcher. She knew that to move would be obedience, and to remain would be defiance. Yet her body would not shift. It was as if the air between her and the prince had locked her in place. Fernando's voice came before she could find her own. "She will not move." The murmurs in the crowd sharpened. One of the older nobles muttered to his companion, their voices low but edged with incredulity. The master of ceremonies held his staff a fraction higher, glancing toward the dais as though seeking permission for intervention. The Queen Mother turned her head slightly, her eyes settling on the captain of the royal guard. "Escort the maid from the hall." The order struck through the stillness, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Across the far end of the room, the glint of polished helmets caught the light as two guards stepped forward. The sound of their boots was unnervingly loud against the marble, each strike an inexorable beat drawing closer. Fernando moved at once, stepping into their path. The cut of his uniform, the gleam of his medals, the shadow of his sword, all declared his rank without the need for words. His voice was steady, almost quiet, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "No man will lay a hand on her." The guards hesitated, eyes flicking to the captain for guidance. The Queen Mother's expression did not alter, but the faint tension at the corners of her mouth betrayed her displeasure. Inez's breath was shallow, her chest tight with the awareness that she was standing at the center of an open defiance that could not easily be undone. The knowledge was dizzying, frightening, and yet, in some small, bewildering way, it warmed her. That someone would stand before her like this, against all the rules that governed his life. The guards came to a halt mere steps away. The captain, a tall figure with a steady gaze, awaited the Queen Mother's next command. The Queen Mother's voice was calm, deliberate. "Then bring them both." Another ripple of whispers surged through the hall. Several nobles exchanged looks heavy with meaning, alliances shifting, loyalties weighing themselves. The musicians in the gallery had fallen silent, their instruments resting in still hands as they watched the unfolding spectacle. Fernando did not move from his place. His hand rested lightly at his side, close enough that Inez felt the nearness of it, though he did not touch her. The guards stood in their line of approach, waiting for the next signal, their presence a wall of polished metal and discipline. Inez realized her knuckles had whitened around the handle of the pitcher. Slowly she set it down on the table, the faint ring of silver against the wood barely audible in the charged quiet. Her eyes lifted to Fernando, searching his face for some sign of what would happen next. The Queen Mother's gaze swept over them both, unblinking. She inclined her head once toward the captain. The guards stepped forward, closing the final distance. One of them reached for Inez's arm. The guard's gloved hand closed around Inez's arm, the pressure firm but not yet cruel. Her breath caught, a thin, sharp sound that seemed too loud in the strained silence. Instinct urged her to pull away, but before she could move, Fernando stepped between them. His shoulder brushed hers, warm, solid, unmistakably present, and the scent of him, leather and sun-warmed wool, cut through the metallic tang of the guard's armor. The prince's voice came low, the kind of tone that carried without being raised. "Release her." The guard's fingers hesitated. His gaze shifted to the captain, seeking direction, but Fernando did not look away. His presence was command enough. From the dais, the Queen Mother's stillness had sharpened into something harder. She did not speak, but her eyes followed every motion, her control over the room palpable, even when challenged. Inez stood very still, though her heart was hammering, her thoughts clashing between the wish to vanish and the knowledge that movement could make her more of a spectacle. The crowd's murmurs had begun again, low currents of speculation threading between the pillars and gilded moldings. Fernando angled himself toward her, his voice for her alone. "Come." The word was not a question. His hand reached back, palm open, and for a single suspended breath she stared at it, knowing the meaning of what it would look like if she took it. The heat rose in her face. She placed her hand in his. A ripple of disbelief passed through the hall like the shudder before a wave breaks. Nobles shifted aside as he guided her forward, his pace steady, forcing the guards to match him or block their sovereign's path. At the edge of the room, a narrow corridor opened behind a column, one of the servants' passages that ran through the palace like hidden veins. Fernando led her toward it, the silver hem of her apron brushing against her skirts as she tried to keep up with his stride. "Your Highness," the captain's voice rang out, respectful but edged with warning. Fernando did not slow. "Stand aside." The corridor loomed ahead, dimly lit by a single wall sconce. Inez could hear the echo of their steps, her own light ones tangled with the measured fall of his boots. The murmurs from the hall swelled behind them, not fading, but following, a living reminder that every eye had seen them leave together. 2 guards appeared at the passage entrance, their spears crossed in a silent barrier. The gleam of the metal under the low light was like drawn lines between obedience and defiance. Fernando stopped just short of the crossed blades, his grip tightening slightly on her hand, as if to assure her, or himself, that he would not let go. "Move," he ordered. Neither guard obeyed. Their stances were precise, their faces blank as stone. Inez's voice came out in a whisper, shaken. "They won't." "They will," he said, his tone quiet, but laced with a certainty that made her chest tighten. One of the guards shifted his weight, but did not uncross his weapon. The silence pressed heavier, the flicker of the sconce casting shadows across Fernando's face, deepening the lines of determination around his mouth. Behind them, the sound of boots on marble grew louder. The court was no longer contained to the hall. The Queen Mother's command had set the palace itself in motion. Fernando's gaze locked on the nearer guard. "Lower your weapon." The man's jaw tightened. "Forgive me, Your Highness, but we have orders." Fernando's grip on Inez's hand did not slacken. His next words were calm, deliberate, edged with something that made both guards straighten. "You may serve my mother's orders today, but you will serve my crown tomorrow. Remember which one will last longer." For a moment, nothing moved. Then the sound of marching boots drew closer, the echo filling the corridor like the drumbeat of a slow, inevitable advance. The captain of the guard appeared at the far end, the polished brass of his helmet catching the sconce's light. The captain's approach was unhurried, each step deliberate, the sound of his boots carrying authority down the narrow corridor. The polished plates of his armor reflected the sconce's flame, sending flickers of gold and shadow across the stone walls. His gloved hands were clasped loosely behind his back, but the precision of his posture spoke of discipline honed over decades in service. Fernando did not move. The air between the 2 men tightened, as though the space itself had braced for impact. Inez felt her pulse beat hard in her throat, the heat of the prince's hand around hers the only steady thing in a world that seemed suddenly unstable. The captain's eyes swept over her, not lingering, not softening, before settling on Fernando. "Your Highness," he said evenly, "you are requested to return to the hall." "I am leaving it," Fernando replied, his voice calm but unyielding. The guards at the corridor's entrance shifted their weight subtly, as if anticipating the need to act. The crossed spears remained where they were, an unbroken line of refusal. The captain's gaze sharpened. "I am charged with ensuring the safety and dignity of the crown." Fernando's jaw set. "And I am charged with upholding the will of the crown's heir." A faint tension rippled through the small space, like the tremor before a string snaps. The captain stepped closer, his shadow stretching over the stone floor between them. You know the position you place me in, Highness. I do, Fernando said, and I also know the position you place yourself in when you disobey me. The words were not shouted, yet their weight seemed to press against the corridor walls. The guards by the door exchanged a quick glance, their rigid discipline cracking for a heartbeat. Inez stood silent, her fingers still caught in Fernando's hold, the skin of her palm warm against his. Her breath was shallow, her senses sharpened to the glint of steel, the faint tang of oil from the weapons, the quiet hum of the sconce flame fighting the draft. The captain looked at her again, as if measuring the exact worth of what, or who, was at stake. Then his eyes returned to Fernando. The Queen Mother will have her answer. Fernando's voice softened, but his resolve did not. She already does. The words hung there, not quite defiance, not quite surrender, but something that made the captain's brow crease in thought. From the far end of the hall came the muffled sounds of voices. The court, restless and waiting. The echo of their murmur seemed to flow into the corridor, mingling with the slow exhale of tension that neither side had yet broken. The captain straightened fully, as if coming to a decision. He stepped aside, clearing the space between the guards, but the reprieve was not what it seemed. "Escort them," he ordered the nearest men. "They go to the Queen Mother's chamber." The words cut through Inez's chest like a sudden drop in the air, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. Fernando's grip on her hand did not falter, but she felt the subtle shift in his stance. A readiness, a watchfulness. The guards lowered their spears, the metallic rasp echoing briefly before the silence reclaimed the corridor. The captain gestured for them to move forward. They moved as one, not by choice but by pressure, guards tightening around them like a narrowing ring, the corridor swallowing the sound of the court, until only the echo of boots and the faint gutter of the sconce remained. The captain's gesture had set the machinery of the palace in motion. Now it was all creak and grind, relentless and impersonal. Inez felt the circle of steel around them, the measured restraint of men trained to obey. The back of her hand still warmed from the prince's hold, and that single point of contact steadied her more than she dared admit. Fernando stayed slightly in front of her, his body a shield, his gaze fixed and level as he addressed the captain without raising his voice. "They will not separate us." The captain's eyes flicked to their linked hands and back. "No one suggested it, Highness." "You will not suggest it," Fernando said. "Not now, not within her sight." The captain inclined his head a fraction, acknowledging the line that had been drawn. "My orders are to escort you both. Then we understand each other." They walked. The corridor narrowed, stone walls closing them into a channel where every breath seemed loud. The torchlight brushed across Fernando's profile, the hard cut of his cheekbone, the steadiness of his mouth. And Inez caught the scent of smoke and oil and the faint citrus that belonged to him alone. Fear and something fiercer threaded through her, and under it a pulse of incredulous wonder that he held her hand as if it were the most natural claim in the world. Behind them, the echoes of distant voices swelled and fell like surf. In the small spaces between bootfalls, she heard the rub of leather, the soft chime of the metal at his breast when his stride lengthened. A guard to their left cleared his throat. Another tightened his grip on a spear. The air thinned with the weight of the unsaid. "You grasp the spectacle you're making," the captain said at last, his tone free of accusation, edged only with reality. Fernando didn't slow. "I grasp it precisely." "And the repercussion?" Fernando's fingers closed around hers, firm. "I choose it." Inez found her voice only because the silence seemed to demand it. "Your Highness, this is mine to carry," he said quietly, not looking away from the path ahead. "Not yours." She swore her heart could be heard in the corridor. "They will blame me. They will try." His thumb pressed once against her hand, a small, decisive touch that made heat break through the chill in her skin. "I won't allow it." The captain glanced at the nearest man. "No one speaks of her. No one touches her. If there is blame, It ends at me. A murmur of assent passed along the guards, reluctant but obedient. The corridor bent, and with the turn came a subtle drop in temperature, air cooling with stone that had known centuries. Inez looked up once, catching the severe lines of a cornice where dust had gathered, the narrow slit of a window admitting a thread of night. The palace heaved around them with a history that did not forgive deviation. She felt it like a hand at her back, pushing. "You don't need to do this," she whispered, because she had to say it once, even if it made no difference. "You could turn back and nothing would be lost." "Everything would be lost," he said, and the simple truth of it sank through her like a weight and a relief all at once. A guard to her right spoke without thinking, the words breaking free before discipline could catch them. "Highness, the court—" Fernando cut him off with a look that was not harsh so much as absolute. "I know the court." The guard's mouth closed. They reached an intersection of corridors. A pair of servants stepped back, eyes wide, backs flat to the wall. One made the sign of the cross, swift and furtive. Inez saw it and swallowed against the sudden ache at the base of her throat. She had always been among such people, invisible, necessary, and now she was something else entirely, a walking provocation, a fault line opening under the palace. "Captain," Fernando said without turning his head, "if anyone attempts to take her from me, they will answer to me before they answer to the Queen Mother." "My orders are clear," the captain replied. "You will have no interference." "Good." They walked again, turning down a corridor less traveled, where the candles were fewer and the shadows took their liberties. Inez lifted her free hand to steady the edge of her apron, only then realizing that her fingers were cold. She'd left the silver pitcher on the table like an abandoned thought. Her life, lined up in habitual gestures, polish, pour, retreat, felt suddenly small against the scale of what kept pace at her side. The captain kept them moving at a restrained pace, neither hurried nor leisurely, as if speed itself would signal weakness. His discipline radiated outward. The guards' footfalls fell into a balanced rhythm, the spears held with exact angles that drew invisible lines around the prince and the maid. Inez felt those lines more than she saw them, a geometry of rule and protection and threat. The silence reached a point where it had to break. It did so in the captain's voice, low enough that it didn't carry past their tight formation. "You could still return to the hall and choose as expected. The Queen Mother would allow you that." "The hall will still be there," Fernando said. "My mind will not. You intend to set yourself against the whole of them. I intend to stand." He glanced at Inez, and the glance held more than stubbornness. It held the promise of endurance, the knowledge of cost. "Are you afraid?" he asked her, so quietly that she might have imagined it. "Yes," she said, because the truth would not shame her. "But not of you." Something in his expression softened, fleeting but deep. "Good." The corridor widened briefly, allowing a wash of pale light from a high window to lay across the floor. Dust floated in the beam, a slow, luminous drift. For a moment, they passed through it like moving through a lighter air, and the touch of his hand felt not only protective, but vital, as if it connected her to the only safe current in a tide. From far behind, a door shut, the sound flat and distant. The captain quickened his stride by a fraction. The guards adjusted without a word, and the circle contracted tighter around them. The implied message was unmistakable. They were approaching the heart of the palace's authority. "Captain," Fernando said again, his tone shifting to steel, "if any of your men push her, restrain her, or frighten her, I will dismiss them by sundown." The captain didn't flinch. "They won't. They will remember this night," Fernando added, "for their restraint." "They will remember it," the captain said, "for yours." The exchange settled like a pact neither man would admit to making. Inez breathed more evenly, though each inhale still caught against the edge of the unknown. Her cheeks had cooled. The skin at the back of her neck prickled under loose tendrils of hair. She became acutely aware of the press of linen at her bodice, the pinch of the apron ties, the brush of the prince's knuckles when their hands shifted in step. Every sensation seemed magnified, as if the body knew what the mind could not prepare for. Another turn, a brief corridor with a tapestry that she had dusted dozens of times but never truly seen. It depicted a hunt, hounds leaping, men with spears reaching. Tonight the scene felt too apt, a noble pageant for pursuit. She could not stop the small sound that escaped her, not a sob, just a breath that carried too much. Fernando's fingers tightened, an answer. They passed a pair of courtiers stationed at a crossway, messengers by their dress. Their eyes widened, then dropped immediately. Word would run ahead of them like fire through dry brush. Inez tasted the copper of fear and the salt of her own restraint. The captain slowed as the corridor narrowed again. The air cooled further. The stone here held night like a memory. Inez knew this passage by rumor, and by the way maids avoided it when they could, not because it was forbidden, but because it led somewhere where mistakes could not be swept away with clean linens and erased footprints. The Queen Mother did her speaking, where candles burned steady and doors closed tight. Fernando felt her hesitation in the check of her step. He didn't look at her, but his thumb moved once more over her knuckles, a wordless reassurance that sent a thread of warmth through her despite herself. "Almost there," he said, the words a promise or a warning, perhaps both. The captain raised a hand, and their formation paused. The guards shifted, 3 in front, 2 behind, the rest to the sides, creating a stillness that felt like the held breath before a plunge. The corridor bent one last time. Beyond it, a short stretch of stone ended at a door darker than the wall around it, iron fittings swallowing the light. "Your Highness," the captain said, formal now, as if each syllable were a step on a staircase. "We proceed under the Queen Mother's authority." Fernando's reply was equally measured. "And under mine." They moved the final yards. The door loomed close enough that Inez could see the grain of the wood, old and polished by hands far more powerful than hers. She heard nothing beyond it, no murmurs, no movement, only the low, relentless beat of her own heart and the muted hiss of torch flame. A guard to the right reached for the latch, but the captain stopped him with a slight gesture and stepped forward himself. He glanced once at Fernando, once at Inez, and lifted his hand to knock. The knock was a muted thud against the heavy wood, the sound swallowed by the thick stone around them. No answer came, but after a pause that felt deliberate, the latch turned from within. The door opened without haste, revealing a room steeped in the kind of stillness that seemed to exist outside of time. The Queen Mother's private chamber was dimmer than the corridors, the light softened by heavy curtains drawn across tall windows. The air held the faint, sweet weight of incense, mingled with the sharper tang of ink. The furnishings were solid, carved, and dark with age, their surfaces polished to a sheen that reflected the flicker of a few steady candles. She sat at a writing desk near the far wall, the quill poised in her hand, as if the interruption were no more than a passing breeze. The pale silk of her gown caught glints of light as she set the pen aside with measured care. Her gaze lifted, and though her face remained composed, it was the sort of composure that could cut. Fernando entered first, still holding Inez's hand. He did not bow, but his step slowed, as if by mutual recognition of the place they had entered. Not a hall for ceremony, but the seat of judgment behind closed doors. The guards remained just inside the threshold, forming a silent frame around the scene. For a moment, no one spoke. The Queen Mother's eyes traveled over the linked hands, the closeness between them, and then back to her son's face. She did not look at Inez long, but the brief glance felt like being weighed and measured on a scale that had no room for mercy. "Close the door," she said at last. The sound of the latch falling into place was definitive, a line drawn between what was outside and what would now occur within. Fernando stood as he always did, straight-backed, his chin level, but Inez could feel the tension beneath it in the subtle tautness of his fingers around hers. She kept her gaze lowered, not in submission to the Queen Mother's judgment, but to steady herself in a room where every breath seemed to have consequence. "You've stirred the court into disorder," the Queen Mother said, her voice low but carrying. "Whispers will not be contained by walls tonight." "They are welcome to speak," Fernando replied, his tone calm but not conciliatory. "My choice does not change." Her eyes narrowed slightly, though her hands remained still atop the desk. "Choice is not the privilege of the crown's heir. It is the weight he carries for the realm." Inez listened, silent, the words striking her with a force that was not entirely aimed at her. She could feel the current between mother and son, the push and pull of will and duty, and knew she stood at the crux of it. "The realm will stand," Fernando said, "but I will not be made a stranger to my own life. And when your life ceases to be your own?" The Queen Mother's question fell without heat, but with the certainty of something she had long since accepted for herself. Fernando did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted briefly to Inez, and something softened in it before he turned back to his mother. "Then I will have made it mine in the ways that matter." The Queen Mother regarded them both for a long moment. The faint hiss of candle flame and the occasional distant creak of the old building were the only sounds. She leaned back slightly in her chair, the movement deliberate, as though weighing the shape of her next words. "You may keep her beside you," she said finally, "but you will do so knowing the cost. The alliances your marriage was meant to secure will falter. The families who would have been bound to us will look elsewhere. There will be unrest." "I understand," Fernando said. "You cannot protect her from the court's malice entirely," she continued, "nor from the subtle cruelty that will not speak its name. If she stays, she will be tested." Inez felt the truth of that settle in her bones. Still, she spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but steady. "I have endured worse in silence. I can endure this with purpose." The Queen Mother's eyes flickered toward her, unreadable. "You think you understand the nature of this court?" "No," Inez admitted, "but I understand my own." Something in the Queen Mother's mouth tightened, though whether in disapproval or recognition, Inez could not tell. She looked back to Fernando. "You will carry the consequences. Not the guard, not the chamberlain, not her, you." Fernando inclined his head once, the gesture as much a promise as an acknowledgement. "I will." The Queen Mother reached for the quill again, but her attention lingered on them a moment longer. "Then it is decided. Go back to your people when you are ready, and let them see what they will speak of tomorrow." The air in the chamber seemed to shift, as though the decision had opened a path neither smooth nor safe, but certain. Fernando's fingers tightened briefly around Inez's, and she felt a strange mix of dread and relief. The Queen Mother lowered her gaze to the paper before her, the faint scratch of pen on parchment signaling that for her, the matter was settled. But when Fernando turned toward the door, he did not move at once. Instead, he glanced at Inez, and in his eyes, she saw the unspoken truth. The real test had only just begun. For a breath, no one moved. The quiet in the chamber felt like a final stitch pulled through thick cloth. The decision fastened, the seam unbreakable. Fernando's hand tightened around Inez's as he turned toward the door. She felt the resolve in him as something living and warm, something that would not retreat now that it had chosen a direction. The captain lifted the latch. The corridor beyond was the same narrow ribbon of stone, but it seemed changed by the choice that had been made inside. The guards arranged themselves without a word, adjusting their formation to lead and protect rather than contain. Fernando inclined his head once to the captain, a spare concession given without diminishing his own authority, and stepped forward, drawing Inez with him. She followed, feeling the strangeness of her own breath, light, too quick, touched with the sweetness of relief and the burn of fear. The palace was quieter than it had been minutes ago, the revel of the court muted to a faded murmur, as if the building itself had exhaled. Somewhere a clock counted a late hour in discreet chimes. Night had drawn close to the windows, and the air in the corridors had cooled, carrying the faint taste of damp stone and the tang of extinguished wax. "Are you steady?" Fernando asked, low enough that the words belonged only to her. She nodded. "Yes." His gaze searched her face, not for doubt, but for harm. Finding none, he let out a breath she could almost feel against her temple. "We go together," he said. "All of it." They passed a narrow window slit, a rectangle of ink where the sky pressed against the glass. In that darkness, she caught the ghost of her reflection beside his, her plain dress, her hair drawn back, his coat, his medals like restrained stars. It struck her then, a soft, fierce ache, that he had placed her at his side and left her there. As they wound through the corridors, servants drew back flush to the walls, eyes lowered, faces pale with a knowledge too dangerous to put into words. A pair of courtiers paused at a turning, mouths still as closed fans. The guards' boots made a subdued rhythm that guided them like a drumline through the maze. With each step, Inez's fear loosened its grip, replaced by a clarity that surprised her. She was not an object to be moved, not tonight. She was choosing to. They reached a wider passage where drafts threaded through like fingers. The smell changed. Less incense, more night. The captain gestured toward a stair that would carry them down to the courtyard level. Fernando glanced at Inez, a question in the angle of his head. She answered it by moving first, her hand still firmly held in his, her balance sure on the worn stone steps. The stair opened into a covered arcade. Beyond the arches, the sky had paled to a bruised blue, the kind that comes in the half-hour before dawn when the world holds its breath and decides whether to keep its secrets. Torches bracketed the pillars, their flames subdued. The courtyard lay ahead, a broad sweep of cobbles, flanked by the palace's facades and guarded gates, where the ironwork was already outlined in a faint silver of coming light. "Highness," the captain said quietly, "word has spread." It had. The court had moved. Nobles gathered under the arcades like clusters of shadowed color, their silks dulled by the lack of sun, their faces intent. At the far end, near the gates, a press of citizens had been allowed to stand behind a hedge of pikes. Their voices came and went in low waves, not riotous, not yet, but full of the human noise that forms when something is about to be witnessed. Above, the long line of a balcony cut across the central facade. A figure stood there, still as a carved emblem. The Queen Mother, watching. Inez felt the eyes, hundreds of them, tightening around her like a ring of warm metal. Fernando's hand anchored her. He led her to the first broad step of the palace stairs that opened onto the courtyard. The guards fanned, creating space without force. The air, edged with chill, carried the faint smell of stone and dew, the ghost of last night's smoke. "Look at me," Fernando said under his breath. She did. His expression carried something new in it, not only defiance, commitment, bare and quiet and unadorned. "This is what I intend," he said. "Not in a corridor, not in a whisper. Here." "And after?" she asked, because the truth deserved its edges. "We endure," he said, as if the word were a vow in itself. "We answer to what we've chosen." He released her hand only long enough to climb one step higher and turned to face the assembled court. The movement had its own gravity. Conversation stilled, a shiver passing through silk and velvet like a change in the weather. Inez stood just behind and to his side, not hidden, not thrust forward, placed exactly where he meant her to be. Fernando lifted his chin. He did not call for silence. He did not need to. "You saw last night," he said, his voice carrying cleanly through the air. "You will see again today. I will not choose a bride to please a parchment or to barter the name of my house." He looked to his right, where the Queen Mother stood above them. "I will bear the cost of this, as I was told I must." The Queen Mother's hand rested on the balcony's stone rail, her face unreadable. She neither signaled approval nor reproach. She held, and the holding itself steadied the palace. Fernando turned back to the court. "I choose her," he said. He didn't look down to find Inez's hand. He reached for it, as if his body already knew where it belonged, and closed his fingers around hers before the air could change. Inez. The name moved through the courtyard with a strange life, repeated under breaths, carried outward to the gates, where the citizens pressed forward for a better view. It collided with expectation and lodged there, unyielding. Inez felt it like a flush along her skin, not exposure, but arrival. A rustle rose among the nobles, shock from some, calculation from others, dismay from a few who had measured their daughters' futures against this morning. A gentleman at the edge of a cluster murmured something too soft to carry. A woman drew in a visible breath and steadied herself with a hand against a pillar. The captain did not shift. His men held their line, faces forward. "Your Highness," someone called, the tone trying and failing to sound light. "You would set the court at odds with itself." "It will find its balance," Fernando said, "as all things do when the truth is put at the center." The words struck Inez with a heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment. She had spent years bending herself small, making the shape of her life fit around the demands of rooms like this. Now he was cutting a circle in the open and putting her in it, and for a heartbeat she could not breathe. Then she did, full and clean, the cold air bright as it filled her. A bell tolled from the direction of the cathedral, one deep note, then another, rolling across the rooftops into the courtyard. Its sound threaded through the crowd's tremor and steadied it into something like attention. Another bell answered, farther off, the city waking. Dawn grazed the palace stone and found it pale and patient. The Queen Mother stepped forward on the balcony. She didn't raise her voice, but it carried. "You have heard him," she said to the court below, to the guards, to the servants hidden under archways and the citizens at the gates. "You will remember your places. You will remember yourselves." She paused. "And you will remember that the crown has stood through worse than surprise." It was not a blessing. It was not a condemnation. It was the line she could afford to draw to keep the kingdom from splitting on the spot. The court absorbed it with relief and resentment. The sound they made was the rustle of order finding its footing. Fernando faced Inez fully now, heedless of how many watched. Up close, she saw the small signs of the night on him. The faint shadow at his jaw, the crease at the corner of his mouth. He lifted her hand and spoke softly enough that his words were for her, though the courtyard leaned toward them to catch what it could. "I would have found you even if this had burned down around us," he said. "But I prefer to rebuild." She laughed then. A quiet, incredulous breath that wasn't a laugh at all, merely the body's recognition of joy when it arrived without apology. "I don't know how to be what they expect," she whispered. "Then don't," he said. "Be what I chose. Be what you are." He drew her closer, not dramatically, not like a performance, but as a man who had learned the weight of his own choices and would set them down carefully. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, and the small, private touch cut through the cold morning more surely than the bells. "Say it," she said, before she understood she'd asked. He didn't hesitate. "I love you." The words, simple and clean, changed the shape of the moment. They cut the air like a blade that healed as it passed. The murmurs softened, baffled by the audacity of something so plain. The guards looked straight ahead. The Queen Mother's face did not alter, but her hand lifted and fell once against the stone, a gesture that might have been nothing and might have been acceptance. Inez's throat tightened. She had learned to make her voice small. It had no practice in filling a place like this. But this was not a place she would fill. This was a man. She lifted her chin and answered the only way that felt honest, not by echoing him, but by stepping the final breath of distance and letting him see everything she could not fit into words. He saw it. It lit his eyes from within, a warmth that did not belong to the morning. He bent his head and pressed his mouth to her hand, not to her knuckles, which would have made a token of her, but to the palm he'd held through the night. It was not a courtly kiss. It was a vow. The courtyard, which had been a spring drawn back tight, eased a fraction. People shifted, exhaled, recalibrated. The bells continued their counting, not in celebration, not in mourning, simply in witness. A small voice near the gates called out a blessing. Another shushed it. Both were swallowed by the morning. Fernando straightened, his hand still around hers. "Walk with me," he said. She looked at the steps, at the faces, at the long sweep of stone. She looked back at him. "Where?" "Where they can all see," he said, "and where I can keep you close." They descended one step, then another, moving into the open. The guards adjusted, the court parted by instinct more than will. Dawn found them fully, and turned the world from blue to gold, and if anyone spoke then, Inez did not hear it. The only sound that mattered was the measure of their footsteps together as they crossed the courtyard, and the only truth that mattered was the one he had placed in her hand and refused to let go. Thank you so much for listening to this story, all the way to the end. We hope it moved you, as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.